Hello, I'm Darrell Williams. I'm a professor of history and the dean of the College of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences here at the University of California, Riverside. And it's really a great pleasure to welcome you to the Mel and Sawyer seminar on Archiving Blackness. This seminar brings together a series of public lectures and workshops throughout the 2022-2023 academic year. And it's all made by the generous support of the Mellon Foundation. This seminar brings together an interdisciplinary research group of faculty, graduate students, and postdoctoral fellows to explore the archives of Black life. Those documents, drawings, maps, material culture, photographs, and digital content that shape historical narratives of the past, that impact the material conditions of African and Afro-diasporic peoples in the present, and create imaginative possibilities of a vibrant Black life in the future. We have 3 themes this academic year. In the fall, the afterlives of slavery and colonialism. In the winter, Black ecologies and placemaking. And in the spring, technology, Afrofuturism, and Black speculative fictions. As Dean of the College, I'd like to commend our lead faculty from history, gender and sexuality studies, English, and anthropology, as well as graduate students from anthropology and comparative literature who have brought together such an important, timely, and intellectually challenging program. I wish our speakers and our audience great success, and I look forward to joining you throughout the year that culminates in a conference. Thank you.
Also, as you mentioned, I'd like to thank the Mellon Foundation for this grant, Chaz for support, and staff at Archeology Society. You have so much to bring this all together. So thank you very much for that. So this seminar is, as you said, being led by a multidisciplinary group of faculty, graduate students, and a postdoctoral fellow who, throughout the coming year, will be thinking across disciplinary, geographic, and temporal boundaries to explore alternative methodological engagement with archival materials that push against the silenced, erased, and inhuman contortions of Black life in the past. In doing so, the seminar seeks to conceive of an archival futurity, capacious enough to illuminate expansive notions of Blackness across time and space. Our expertise in this research group, I'm going to tell you about in a second, spans Africa and the African diaspora. And as was mentioned, comes from various fields, including history, archaeology, comparative literature, religious studies, science fiction studies, gender and sexuality studies, photography, and material culture. So by way of brief introduction, our research group is Adebede Adeliu, who is assistant professor here in history at UCR, who works on urban history of Lagos, Nigeria in the 19th century. We have Andre Carrington, who is associate professor of English, whose work focuses on race, gender, and genre in Black American cultural production. Jade Sasser, who is associate professor of gender and sexuality studies, and his work explores how environmental problems such as climate change and exposures intersect with race and gender. And we have Professor Ayana Llewellyn, who is assistant professor of anthropology at Stanford University. And she is a Black feminist archaeologist whose current work examines sartorial practices in post-emancipated Texas, Tennessee, and Virginia. So, so that's the faculty, and then also, because of this grant, we're able to recruit a postdoctoral fellow who will be with us for the year here at UCR, and that is Dr. Abdul Basim, who recently received a PhD from Rice University in religious studies this summer. And his work focuses on Islam and Muslim society in West Africa and African diaspora, often working with manuscripts in Arabic and African languages. And then we have our graduate students who are completing their dissertation. Gracia Perez, who's a PhD candidate in anthropology, working on questions of environmental justice among the Afro-Mexican communities of Mexico's Pacific Coast. And Tifa Yang, a PhD candidate in comparative literature, who researches West African Anglophone literature using masquerade performances as an analytical approach to questions of space, subjectivity, and epistemology. So, as you can see, we have a wide range of disciplinary perspectives, as well as geographic and temporal visualization. So through this series of discussions and activities, this seminar will ask what it means for humanists to research underrepresented voices, specifically African and Black voices perspective, with an archive that has historically been constructed through various forms of anti-Black and gender violence. As was also mentioned, our theme, there's 3 things throughout the year, and our theme this fall is the afterlife of colonialism. And so today, our speaker will start that and have 4 speakers about the quarter, who are a group of scholars and artists who hail from the U.S. Virgin Islands, the Ivory Coast, France, Nigeria, and the United States. So again, we're thinking broadly about this question. So looking forward to a great year, and thank you for your presence today. And please follow us on all the social to keep up with what's happening. And I'll introduce my colleague, Jake Bassett.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wilson, and thank you all for coming today. We are so excited to have you here. So excited to begin this year-long series of events, and I'm thrilled to be introducing you today, Vaughn Belle. So Vaughn Belle explores the material and culture of coloniality, and her work presents counter-visualities and narratives. Working in a variety of disciplines, her practice includes painting, installation, photography, writing, video, and public intervention. She has exhibited her work in the Caribbean, in the US and Europe, in institutions such as the Museo del Barrio in New York, Casa de las Americas in the Museum of the African Diaspora in California, and Künstler Charlottenburg in Denmark. She is the co-creator of I Am Queen Mary, the artist-led groundbreaking monument that confronted the Danish colonial amnesia while commemorating the legacies of resistance of the African people who were brought to the former Danish West Indies. Belle holds an MFA from the Instituto Superior de Arte in Havana, Cuba, and an MA and BA from Columbia University in New York. She is currently working on a manuscript entitled Ledgers from a Lost Kingdom. Her studio is based in the Virgin Islands. Please join me in welcoming Vaughn Belle. Very, very much. I just wanted to double check because I think it's probably very well, but I know that I'm really we're saying that they may not be able to hear. Try to continue. Is everybody able to hear me okay on the line?
Somebody.
The audio is not still so strong. So it's still very difficult to hear.
So maybe if you become the main screen.
Okay. Okay, so can everybody hear me okay? And then maybe just people can double check. Because I can also speak louder. I'm total. Okay, cool. All right. So again, thank you very much for this invitation. I'm really excited to be here. My work, as I mentioned, tends to deal with the materiality of coloniality. Or I don't know, there's like a sound. Oh, it's another one. Okay, cool. When I think about the presentation for today, I wanted to title it How to Survive Colonial Nostalgia, actually. And I partly made a mistake because it's based on a previous work that I did that's called How to Survive Colonial Nostalgia. And it's a nod to a good friend and colleague, Tiffany Yannick, who has a collection of short stories called How to Escape a Leper Colony. So it was a nod to her and also to her previous work. But when I think about colonial nostalgia, I think about it as a desire and yearning for things, objects, conditions, feelings, relationships from the colonial era, specifically a time where slavery in the Caribbean and the Americas, and that it suppresses the harmful legacies by the dominating power structures. And by harm, I mean lies, erasures, stereotyping, and exclusion. And in the case of the Virgin Islands, this harm is felt in both symbolic, spiritual, and material levels. And so to begin, I just wanted to give you a little bit more context of the Virgin Islands. This is a picture of our government house. And I like to show this picture because I think it gives people a very good sense of where we are, literally, physically, symbolically, psychically in our journey. In the middle, we have the Virgin Islands flag, which you could see it's kind of a take on some American symbols because we don't have eagles in the Caribbean. And on the left is the United States flag, and on the right is the Danish flag. And we have not been a part of the Danish Empire for over 100 years. So one might wonder, why do we still have this flag flying on our government house? And I think it's because it really gives you a good sense of how we're still caught between our past, our colonial past, and our colonial present. St. Croix, the island that I lived in, was cut up into about 150 plantations that grew sugar and among other things, and it was divided into various quarters. And as you could see on the right, these quarters then were numbered, and it's very grid-like. It was very violent on the landscape. And you can see in some of the images on the right, images of maybe the plantations, and some of the main features would have been colonial great house, these kind of big mansions that imitate the feudal manners in Europe, readapted to the Caribbean, as well as the sugar mills are usually also very dominantly placed on the map. And these are some examples of what both of those structures look like actually on our landscape. And today we still have many, we don't have as many great houses because a lot of those were burned down in rebellions. But we still do have quite a bit of the sugar mills, which kind of, I would say, stand almost like keloids on our landscape. They're in various stages of ruin, and people have multiple ways that they engage with them, say it like that. Here's one of them. We have a hotel, it's probably the most exclusive hotel on St. Croix. It's called the Buccaneer. Again, even just in the naming, there's a erasure of the fact that pirates were often slave traders. That's often what they were doing in the Caribbean. And this is advertised as a destination wedding event space, and you can have a dinner inside the sugar mill. And just for those of you who may not understand actually what a sugar mill is, what you would have had was rolling pins that the sugarcane stalks would have gone through. And there was usually, that was someone's job to push the stalks through, and that would squeeze the cane juice out. And there was also always someone else's job that would have an axe, because not if, but when somebody's hand would usually have gotten stuck. And so their hand would have been cut off to keep the production going. And so these are extremely violent spaces. And the fact that, they're very commonly used in images to promote tourism in the Caribbean, but specifically in the Virgin Islands, is of course quite problematic and erases a lot of this history. Some other ways that people still kind of engage with these colonial narratives are ideas about conquest and virginity. This is a t-shirt that I remember growing up seeing in the 80s. I slept on a virgin island as kind of a joke. And we still also have actually another hotel that recently opened up it's called The Fred, named after the Danish king that one of our towns is named after, and the website is called Sleep with a Friend. So there's always this kind of idea about sexuality and some kind of intimacy and possession and ownership that's associated with these islands. And then here I thought I would show This is a popular real estate magazine. This is how some of those colonial narratives get repeated in our current day, where you have, it talks about the estates were plantations and ranches. So there's no mention. So usually this site is obviously appealing to white Americans, no mention of what the map is really talking about or what these plantations really were. It kind of glosses over that to kind of attract people for this idea of a slice of an island paradise. And I also wanted to show, because this, of course, is sometimes, we can talk about how the nostalgia impacts people on the outside. I think probably for me, one of the most devastating impacts of being in a space that's still colonized and lives with a lot of this colonial nostalgia is how we begin to regurgitate this and feed it back to ourselves. So I'm going to show you an example of a tourism campaign that was aimed towards mostly Virgin Islanders to teach us how we should treat tourists. And it uses a symbol, a West African folk character that has still survived through slavery. It's called a Mokojumbi. It's a stilt walker. It's usually a figure that's supposed to clean spirits. So you'll see how this traditional African, very spiritual character is then kind of totally transformed in this colonial tourism narrative.
Hey guys, which way is Fort Christian? Now we. We pledge to make our visitors feel welcome. Do you need some help?
Can you help us find Fort
Christian, it's right over there. Let me show you.
Gregory took the pledge.
Because tourism, it's all of us.
So we're not going to spend too much time about this. You could do a whole seminar on just these, because it was a series of them. But of course, you can see the violence of using African culture, traditional Afro-Caribbean culture, the use of children. There's lots of layers of violence in this campaign. And so what does that mean to live, work, make art from a space like this? And for me, my artistic practice has been trying to respond to what does it mean to, I don't think it's possible to actually escape colonial nostalgia. I think it's just possible to survive it. And so a lot of my work has been trying to develop various tools of how to understand this condition of coloniality. So I did a project in 2011 in this great house that's on the western end of St. Croix. It's also a museum. And I will say I was able to do this project because for the first time in its history, it was a Black Caucasian woman that was the director. And she was very open to having conversations and transforming the way this space had been. Because normally, it was mostly, it's run by the St. Croix Landmark Society, which was at that time mostly white Americans that dealt with a lot of colonial nostalgia narratives. So with the coming of her as the director, I pitched this project to do an exhibition inside there and different interventions. And this was one of them. During the exhibition, I invited the people who came to the exhibition to sit and be portraited in the planter's chair. The planter's chair is the ultimate power chair. It's embedded, the power is embedded in the design of the architecture of the chair. The armrest double as footrest so that a servant would unfold it and man, because it's a man, is the planter, would sit down and someone would take off his boots. So it's a whole, it talks about this kind of whole colonial aspect of leisure and service and domination, et cetera. And so I invited people, what would it mean for you to take portraits seated in this chair? As you can see, very early on, we realized how gendered the chair was. Some women felt very comfortable seated that way and others didn't. I was one that didn't, so my portrait is a little different also. But I think for me, what was interesting was just kind of watching how bodies would literally situate themselves. Sometimes they wanted to be actually portraited with family members by themselves, it was a very interesting learning experience for me. I also did a video performance imitating the character Goldilocks and the Three Bears. We know that she's a little girl who wanders in a house that she don't belong to, but she's fast and decides she's gonna go just explore. And so there's a trespass that's kind of happening, but because she's blonde and white, there's an innocence associated with it. And I wanted to know, well, what would it be for my body to do something similar in this space? Especially previously, as I said, the space always has felt a little bit distant, alienating. Usually even there's red velvet ropes, so most people aren't able to touch the things or really even enter the space very much. So for the exhibition, I asked them to remove that and also to allow me to do this performance. Sitting in, historic furniture and all of those things was, I was able to do that. But I kind of go through the house actually fit very perfectly with the narrative of Goldilocks. So I was able to kind of stage the eating of the porridge, go sit in the chairs, and then move into the bed. And then in the sleeping part of the narrative, instead of sleeping in the bed, I sleep in the planter's chair, and then kind of, as the same thing, exit out. But I think for me, the most important thing with that piece is really thinking about, what was I going to learn, and what also was the viewer going to learn? Like watching me kind of touch things, try on things, explore the space with kind of a fancifulness that typically my body in that space would have been, I wouldn't have had that ability to be free and touch things like that. And so it's also really inviting the viewer to kind of think about my body in this space. And then shortly after that exhibition, I began renovation on a property that I bought. As an artist, like in many places in the world, it can be very challenging, especially in a tourism-dominated economy like the Virgin Islands. And so I wanted to stabilize my artistic practice by buying a studio, and I found one that was like $25,000, and I couldn't believe it until I went to go see what the building looked like, and I was like, oh, okay, this is why. So that building actually totally changed my life. It changed my trajectory of my work. I didn't have a lot of money, so I did any of the work I could do myself, I did. And at the opening of that exhibition I had done in the Great House, the historian had come. And when I had mentioned to him that I just purchased this building, he offered to do historical research on my building. I didn't know why. I didn't know anything about the neighborhood. I didn't know anything about anything really in terms of the significance of my building or the neighborhood. It's mostly a lot of abandoned structures or derelict structures. And a couple of weeks later, he met with me and shared with me that the first registered owners were all the way back from 1777. They were African-born women. They survived the Middle Passage, survived slavery, were able to buy themselves out of slavery and own homes in the 1700s, and they were not unusual. Actually, a lot of the housing in that area had similar histories. And I couldn't imagine. I said, but I'm an educated person. I'm somebody who deals with this history. How come this is not something that we know about? So I started a series of research and engagements with my neighbors, talking to them, not just about the renovation parts, but about the history, and just trying to understand, how did we come to this point of amnesia, that we don't know this history of these buildings and why? But what the building and this project also taught me was how it is located in the extended part of what was called at first, like the N-word gut. And first, the area was relegated by law that if you were free, you could only live here. And as you can imagine, that population exponentially grew. And so my house is kind of in the extended part. But when I did the research, what I found really interesting is you're free, but there was lots and lots of restrictions placed on them. They had to carry their free papers. They couldn't marry whites. You couldn't have certain licenses. All manner. If you're a woman, you couldn't wear lace or chain. I mean, there was all manner of restrictions that were placed upon them. But the experience, thinking about the narratives, I was doing a lot of sweeping and the sanding and the painting, and I realized that in that I was kind of getting a different kind of subjectivity and intimacy with the space. And it made me start looking at everything else around me very differently. And so St. Croix has two main towns. They're named after Danish kings. The Danish tradition of naming their kings is one king is King Christian, the other one is King Frederick. So our two towns are Christiansted and Frederiksted. And my studio is in Christiansted. On Frederiksted, the opposite side of the island, it actually looks, they're twin cities, meaning all the street names and everything are very similar, but Frederiksted looks different because of the history of rebellion. So in 1878 was the largest labor revolt in Danish colonial history, and they burnt down a significant part of the town. And in the reconstruction of the town, it happens to be in a period where this Victorian gingerbread fretwork becomes very popular. And Christiansted doesn't really have that. So Frederiksted looks visibly different. And what I thought was so interesting that it's different because of this history of rebellion and how it's marked in the architecture. And I wanted to, as an artist, think about how could I visualize this history of resistance and maybe use some of the tools. So I started employing a technique where I was cutting and burning into paper at the same time, thinking about cutting and burning as a resistance tool. I mean, it's a tool that kind of morphs. Indigenous people used it and the colonists used it to be able to raise the lands and transform them into plantations. But then, of course, the enslaved people and workers also used it when those are the same tools, you know, the cutlass that they were working with, fire, these also became tools of rebellion. So this piece takes the architectural frameworks and patterns from the buildings in Frederiksted, and then kind of makes these small cuts and burns. And intellectually, as I just stated, that was my project. But the first time I showed this piece, someone came up to me and put their hand on my shoulder and was like, "You okay?" And I kind of immediately actually knew what they meant, because the work, when you see it in person, it is thousands of these cuts and burns. And we all know that people who are going through psychological trauma, sometimes they mark and cut and burn their skin in a way. And I was actually going through a very difficult period in my life. My mother had Alzheimer's at the time. And so for me, this work, I like needed it. It was like a very meditative piece. I would sit there and I didn't have a lot of time. I would work on it. And it made me also kind of think about how, as artists, you kind of develop parts in your practice that channel also things, and that your subjectivity really is marked in the work. And that also, of course, made me look at the physical structures that enslaved people were also participating in building, because a lot of times people like to say, oh, that's colonial architecture. But you can imagine if these things were coming through my body and my hand, things were coming through their bodies and their hands too, and they would be marked in the buildings that they were making. So I thought a lot about that. And I thought also about the houses, like my studio, that, you know, the structures are very similar to houses that come out of West African architecture. And I did this project called Constructed Manumissions, which is using the fretwork designs, but the houses have no openings that are visible. There's no windows, no doors, and there's no glue or nails. So it's made by using these little tiny pins. And so there's a fragility in the work. Like if you walk near it, you could see it, you know, and I wanted to kind of talk about this fragility and tenuous nature of freedom, which of course is not just in those historic times that I'm specifically referencing in the work, but we can think about that. I mean, we just experience how our freedom can be quite tenuous for various reasons as well. And then, as I mentioned, there's, you know, my practice really came out of, again, working at this building. And one day when I was sitting outside, I had this almost like a eureka moment looking at these tumbled coral stones in the remains of an outhouse. And they had straight cuts and straight marks. And I kind of was like, why are they here? And then I had this memory, same historian friend, George Tyson, who's been a dear friend of mine and a resource. He directed me to a Danish colonial planter that wrote a little bit about the harvesting of these coral stones. And he describes that enslaved people being sent out into the ocean at low tide, harvesting them, and that these stones would be used for mostly two things. One is they're the foundation of all the buildings that we see. And then the Danish brick that was imported would be what's placed on top. So it kind of covers over that part. And I thought that was such an interesting metaphor for how the labor, the lives of African people are also kind of covered over, but we see them in the ruins of the Danish structures. So I thought that was such like a very poignant and beautiful metaphor. And the other thing that I did mention, it was two things. The corals would also use, it would be burnt and used as part of the mortar to kind of build everything else. So I thought, again, a beautiful metaphor. When I was first approached to think about doing a monument to think about the Danish colonial history and the relationship between the Virgin Islands and Denmark, my first gesture was this mock-up, which I called Trading Posts, which is instead of thinking about a sculpture which has the sculpture on top of a plinth, the plinth is actually the sculpture, referencing this foundation of labor, this foundation of not just labor, but of people and their strength and resilience and their spirituality, all those things that I just mentioned comes through in their hand that you saw in these stones. And then also I would find these outside my studio. And these are colonial era pottery. The biggest one is from the Royal Copenhagen, which is kind of rare because that's the good stuff. What we see is a lot of, like willowware, a lot of the imitation things that was coming from the United States. But this is porcelain that came from Denmark. And I find them, anytime it rains really hard outside of my studio, they just kind of resurface, which I thought was also this interesting metaphor of these histories that are unruly that kind of keep resurfacing. And in St. Croix in the Virgin Islands, we actually have a name for this type of pottery. We call it chaney. Chaney is a hybrid word that means China and money. And it's called that because during slavery times, children would round them to look like coins, and they would use them in play games and things like that. And so that's not a common tradition now, but the name has stuck. So we still call, even if they're not rounded, we call all the fragments, we call them chaney. And so we use them now. There's like a cottage industry of jewelry where people use them and they put them in parts of jewelry. We wear them on the body, which I find really interesting, how these things of the body that come across the Atlantic and are used in the Caribbean, and then they kind of get tossed out for various reasons where they break, rebellions, etc. And that we found a way to kind of bring them back to the body and use them in another way. And so I started a series of paintings where I was, when you look at them, they kind of looked like these miniature paintings. But what I thought interesting is that I didn't know what came before or after. It was like just these fragments. I couldn't really see the full petal or pattern or what it was. And so I had to just use my imagination. So these paintings I call them kind of process paintings. I'm using those bits and pieces of fragments. I would just kind of look at them and piece them together. And for me, they definitely have both the beauty and the violence. And in some ways, they're also a kind of mapping. Because if you start to pay attention, you realize that some of the petals, they don't quite make sense, but we make them make sense. And I feel like as somebody from the Caribbean, where we're a mixture of civilizations from Asia, Africa, Europe, the Middle East, even, how we don't always know our full identities. We're kind of like these fragments, and also, of course, the indigenous people, and we're fragments that we've kind of pieced together to create something new. And so these paintings I've also started doing by thinking about the fragmentation as a part of the structure. This is kind of one that I did in 2020, which is a long piece that has, I think I did it as maybe diptychs, and then I rearranged them. So it's another version, another take on that. And the very first time I got a chance to really engage with the archives was in 2008 on my very first trip to Denmark. It's important to note that the Virgin Islands, when Denmark sold us to the United States the sale happened in 1916 and the transfer in 1917. They came back with an archivist and they collected all the archives and took them. They even took things that didn't belong to them, like all of our indigenous artifacts. They also have them in Denmark. And so we're a place that's had to create our memory without our archives. And so the first time I went to Denmark on an artist residency, there was a woman who was doing a PhD on a set of archives that were in the National Library that were photo albums of Danish West Indian families that had gone back and they had gotten donated to the institution. And I had never seen these images before, like most Virgin Islanders had never. And it was like a rabbit hole. But there are two images that were seared into me. And this was one of them. It was a postcard that would just keep coming up of this small, beautiful child, but crying and in distress. And I just thought, like, why is that here? Why was this an image that would be circulated? And as I mentioned, my mother had Alzheimer's. So at some point through her disease, I started looking in our own albums, kind of maybe looking for her memories in a way. And I saw the image of myself on the top left. And then I remembered the image I had seen in Denmark. And I was like, my God, that kind of reminds me of that image. So I went to find it, put the two of them together. And I thought it just said something really interesting. Putting the tool of juxtaposition, putting these two things next to each other said something. On the inscription of this postcard, it says St. Croix Picney, DWI, which stands for Danish West Indies. And many of you may know Picney is kind of a slave word, as it comes to describe children, a way to distance them from their humanity. And so I decided to reuse that label to describe myself, but then to put it as USVI, to comment a little bit, well, a lot on our relationship to the United States, our current colonial relationship to the United States. And I think what's interesting about my picture is that you can't quite tell if I'm crying or laughing. It's kind of ambiguous. And then I went through, I tried to find if there were other things in my personal family album that I could find with these albums that were in the archives, and to see what narratives, what compositions in the composition and what they were talking about. And I did find a few. For time, I'll just maybe talk about one more. The one with my mother, I think, is interesting. So on the bottom left, you see that it says in the archives, it labels it as a woman with child of upper class. So just this designation of class I found really interesting. And you see her signifiers from the house she's standing behind, her hair, the clothes she has, the clothes the baby's wearing, etc. And then I found this image of my mother, because there was a time, maybe some of you are old enough to remember that a lot of people kind of took pictures of themselves in front of their homes. It was like a way to signify, like to present yourself, signify like you're presenting yourself. So my mom had this picture of herself with my baby brother, and you can see also the class signifiers. The house on a hill, it's 2-story, it's concrete, her hair is straightened, she's wearing a pantsuit, polyester, so it's like those all these things that signify class, and just kind of, I found that really interesting, just thinking about this cross between time and space and places, etc. And then this is the series that I had started called How to Survive the Colonial Nostalgia. It was commissioned in 2017. And there's a challenge when you're looking at a lot of these images. If anyone spent time in colonial archives, they're not easy to look at, because there's kind of like this hegemony in the images that are constantly being presented by the way the people are being presented, the way the Black people are being presented, the way the white people are being presented, the way the landscape is being presented, the work, everything. It's all constructed. And what happens is it starts to kind of invade you. And I wanted to protect myself a bit from that. So I had started to think about creating a series of digital manipulations where I transform the images so they look both like El Mal de Ojo, because I lived in Cuba for many years. And so on the threshold of many people's doors, they would have this evil eye symbol to kind of protect you from a particular kind of gaze. And I was kind of trying to protect myself from this colonial gaze. And then also the images are also in the very inside, they're being pulled from black hole images, which is one of the most destructive elements in the universe. And I thought that maybe for me, it was kind of just thinking about this piece that I could kind of both repel the colonial gaze, but also like destroy it in a way. That was kind of my idea for the piece. But I didn't feel it was enough. As soon as I made that piece, I was like, I don't know about this piece. So I decided to employ the cuts and burns that I was doing in the actual photograph. And this piece is called Swarm, and I'm kind of creating, I'm almost envisioning myself like a conjurer going back into time to rescue is a little dramatic, but you know, I was trying to separate the Black figures from the hold of the hegemony in a way. And so my goal was, I'm just gonna go in and I'm just gonna burn and cut everything around them so that they now are more foregrounded. And then I had to decide, well, what happens when I get to the little white babies? What am I gonna do with them? What does that mean to like cut and burn into these children? I mean, what, and I had to I realized like, there is no moving beyond colonial nostalgia without extractions. And I also realized that there is no innocence in the colonial project, none. So, I burned them too, cut through those two. And this piece for me, it's a series, I've been doing them for a while. There's lots of different, there's lots and lots of material to do this with. It reminds me also a little bit, I was doing this after Stranger Things had come out, and you know that blob that you kind of like flashes. So I was kind of thinking about also this kind of energy that you see but can't quite see. And then I've also, this is the piece I was telling Jody, I was like, or maybe it was Andre actually, that there was a piece that I kind of pulled it out, but then I realized, no, I think it's really important to bring this piece back in. So I checked the time because, so the work that I had been doing in the historic renovations on my studio led me actually to do others. And there were so many Danes that were engaged with colonial history. This is not something most people don't even know. Denmark was a enslaver or colonizers. Most of them don't know that either. But during this time, there were lots of people that were coming and doing projects. And there was a woman, her name was Una Lund. She was an architect. She'd actually been working in the Virgin Islands for a while, helping to do rebuilding of the forts. And she was going to do a book around the centennial anniversary, the 100-year anniversary, which happened in 2017. And so she interviewed me for her book because most people focus on all of the big grand structures, the forts, the big townhouses, the great houses. Rarely do people focus on the little houses that I was dealing with, the vernacular houses, the houses of the formerly enslaved or the enslaved. And so she wanted to honor my work and include me. She did a little interview with me, and then she came out with the book. And then someone got an advance copy. And as I mentioned, many, many Danes were coming that year. So another woman who had interviewed me had said, I got an advance copy of the book, and what you just told me is very different from what's in the book. And I said, really? What do you think? And she said, well, she says that the woman that you talk about that were the first owner, she calls them a word in Danish that's like your foremothers. It's almost like she's saying that you're related to them. And I thought, unless I'm like the Queen of Denmark, how is someone related to a building for 200 years? That's so unusual, especially if you understand housing in the Caribbean, how most people lived on plantations well up into the 20th century. I mean, just it was a fantastical story, but it wasn't true. And then she also said that I inherited the buildings, which, as you heard, I mean, I bought them with like every last penny. I took things, I did, so she erased that labor. But what she also did inadvertently, which she also said, my parents were the kind of persons that would give me a derelict building as my inheritance, which for me was the most insulting. Because my parents came out of colonial societies where hands were inspected before they go to school. Like they were not going to have a building in the condition that I had bought that building in. And so it was very painful for me that she had written that. So I wrote to her, as I said, she was trying to honor my work. So I wrote to her with a lot of respect and just said, hey, I heard that your book came out, congratulations, but I heard there might be some mistakes. Could you tell me a little bit about that? And she said she was on holiday, but that she would check when she got back, but she might have gotten some things wrong. And that's when I was like, oh, okay, well, that's a problem. And I explained to her why this is problematic. And she then sent a message back apologizing, but not offering really any redress. She did offer, she said, well, if anything, if I have an English version, I'll make sure it's corrected, and any future editions, I'll make sure it's corrected. But no public, no errata page or anything like that. So I asked her, well, could you explain to me like how you came to write these things? Because I didn't tell you, like, it's not even like a, oh, I thought you said, it wasn't a small mistake. It's like totally different from what we talked about. How did you do that? And so we started a series of emails back and forth, almost over 6 months. And I sometimes were very frustrated. But they were all very respectful, but just trying to understand how this happened, like get into the mindset, because regardless, at the end of the journey, I was still quite frustrated. Another journalist had come around the centennial and interviewed me, and she learned about me in the book, because the book is now out in Danish bookstores and people are seeing it. It's a coffee table book. It's beautiful. It's about the colonies. And so she wanted to interview me about my work. And I told her, well, there's things wrong in the book. And that process of correcting the story, I felt very empowered by that. And then I realized that as an artist, I had within my power something that could trump. I hate the fact that, it's now another reference to that word, but I could trump the power. I could penetrate the power of the book, about the authority, the narrative authority of the book. So what I did for my solo exhibition in Denmark was I decided to show her book as an installation, open to the page where she talks about me, and then publish all of our correspondence over the last few months. And yes, the curators were like, about that, like ethics. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about ethics. And I said, yes, let's talk about ethics. Let's talk about what the archives actually are. They are other people's personal correspondence, narratives, all those things. They're full of tons of mistakes, tons of projections. And I want to show how that's being created and how it's still being created even today, because it's just happening to me right now. And I want to show that. So they were excited, but they were like, oh yes, it makes so much sense. And so this was the piece. It was called Errata. It was my own Errata page. And if you want, you can read it on my website, the full piece. And that piece was very empowering for me, but definitely not as empowering as this next project that I'm going to talk about, which is I Am Queen Mary. And this project had many, many beginnings. First, some beginnings with a Danish professor who was anticipating the upcoming centennial and was looking out for who she could do projects with, and realized that not a lot was happening other than in artist spaces, that artists were the ones that were leading the conversation around decoloniality. And so she came to St. Croix in around 2015 or 14 and pitched this idea of doing a project with me and another artist of Caribbean descent that's Danish, but her father's from Trinidad, Black Trinidadian. And she had this idea of taking the warehouse in Copenhagen and the warehouse in St. Croix and doing a series of exhibitions and exchanges, and then commissioning me and Jeanette to do a monument. And Jeanette's idea came very much out of her experience of being Afro-Dane, of having her body and the violence upon her body in a space like Denmark, which conceives of itself very much through whiteness. And so she had been doing this performance piece where she whips black ash onto a white canvas. And then for that, she had created this image on the top right, where she sits, she uses this iconic image of the Black Panther, Huey P. Newton, and the character she uses in her performance, she kind of recreates that in this chair. And then for me, that was my response, was the piece Trading Post. It was thinking very much about my experience living in the remnants of all this coloniality and the material remnants, and kind of thinking about that. And we decided eventually to work together. And she had also started to think about her character and merging it with the mythology of Queen Mary, who is one of the women who led the same labor revolt that I talked about that burnt down much of the town. She's one of the most famous and iconic and kind of like a national heroine. So much so that we have folk songs that we sing about her, that we grow up our highways named after her. And one of our 2 highways, not like a lot of highways, we just have one of our highways is named after her. But what's so interesting about her narrative and dealing with the archives is I am also a member of a Black feminist collective called the Virgin Island Studies Collective, where Tiffany Yannick, who I mentioned before, who's a writer, Hadia Sawyer, who's a philosopher and Africana studies person, and Tammy Navarro, who's an anthropologist. We have been working together since around the time of this 2017 and doing different archival engagements together because we're multidisciplinary and we all come from different perspectives. And one of the projects we did was to deal with the prison records of the 4 women who were taken to Denmark for their role and participation. And we know them as the queens of the firebond. So we're taking this kind of African Caribbean tradition of taking women who are strong and rebellious in a way, and they're elevated to the status of queen. What's interesting about Queen Mary or Mary Thomas is that her power and this naming was so powerful that in her prison record, they say the one who was called the queen. The other women, they kind of became queens like the Central Park Five. They became queens through the criminality, through being arrested together. But she came in as a queen, which is I think also why she's probably the most famous. So Jeanette and I, what we decided to do was we did a reenactment of her. It's an allegorical portrait where we did a 3D body scan of our bodies. And when you think about body scanning, oops, sorry. Is it gonna play? When you think about body scanning, you're also thinking about like we're scanning our own body as an archive, right? Because my nose is my father's nose, it's my father's father's nose, and like all that history that we carry within our bodies. So we decided to scan our bodies and merge them to kind of create this bridge between our 2 spaces and histories. And so then it becomes digitally manipulated and fused, and that becomes the figure. And so it's a 3D digital manipulation to create the figure of Mary Thomas. And then in terms of the coral stones, we took about 1 ton of corals, imported them from the Caribbean. So they made another trek back across, well, not back across, but across the Atlantic. And they become the base of this 2.5-story sculpture that we do in front of the Danish West Indian, the former Danish West Indian warehouse. And part of the sides of the sculpture, let's see if I have another image. Maybe part of the sides is because we're responding on the other side of the building. There's a sculpture of Michelangelo's David. The building has been currently used to house what's called the Royal Cast Collection, which is pretty much copies of very famous sculptures from Greek antiquity up to the Renaissance, I believe. And so we're creating a counter visuale on many levels, both of course in art history because of what's on the other side with Michelangelo, but also kind of signaling the history of the building, which to give you a sense of where Denmark is with their colonial history, all the colonial warehouses had already been sold because they also had colonies in Tranquebar in India. Those were already sold, turned into lofts, and and so this was the one that it actually was pending sale when we did this engagement. They had closed the museum and it was pending sale. So when we did our project, we were able to first get temporary permission. And I can say that we were fighting against a lot of things because it's an artist-driven project. Remember, it came first from this Danish professor and she wasn't able to really raise the money. Jeanette was able to raise it in Denmark because there was some money put aside for the centennial. That's how 2 projects fused to one and why it also moves to Denmark. And, but we were definitely pushing into the public space. And I say that because when we inaugurated, this is a picture of the inauguration day, there are quite a lot of people, but there would have been a lot more. It was Easter and it was bitterly cold. But I can say that one of our advocates that had been really advocating for this project, no one from the Danish institutions, cultural institutions, they didn't come. They really thought that this was going to be like this 2 Little Black Girl project. Okay, now the centennial is over, going down. We anticipated that. So we hired a PR company to help us because we knew that the narrative had to get bigger than just even Denmark and the Virgin Islands. And so, and we hit like a zeitgeist. It was right after what happened in North Carolina. And so here we are doing this project and it got a lot of attention. It's the first sculpture of a Black woman, possibly in Scandinavia, but definitely in Denmark. And, you know, it was this 100-year anniversary, et cetera. And so, you know, we got a lot of press, everything from the New York Times, Time Magazine, The Guardian. Winnie Mandela had died that week, I remember, and they put our sculpture in conversation with how do you commemorate women that have controversial histories. The title of the piece is very significant. Even though it's merging two separate works, I knew that it would be controversial in the Virgin Islands to put our faces in a national icon. And so what we really wanted people to understand is that we are doing a reenactment. We're inviting you into the history. It's very similar to what Jeanette had already been doing in my work, what I had been doing even from the planter's chair. I had been inviting people to situate themselves in other people's histories. So we titled the work, I Am Queen Mary, which there are other references, and whether it be the I Am the Man placards, or in Cuba, children are asked to say somos como el Che, like we are like Che Guevara. Or even in Spike Lee's film, at the end of Malcolm X's film, he has people just say, I am Malcolm X. It's like the last sequence in the film. It's a very beautiful sequence. And so in 2019, we were invited by the Ford Foundation to actually do a smaller version of the sculpture. This is currently in Barnard. The sculpture looks different when it's a more human scale. And also we were able to kind of retain some of the original features of my piece, which was having the plexiglass and encasing it. Since it didn't have to comment so directly with the other sculpture that was there, we were able to transform it a bit. Unfortunately, in that hellish year of 2020, there was a winter storm that really damaged the sculpture. And so we had to take it down. It was damaged, it was beheaded, it was damaged beyond, there were other people have asked us, like, are you sure it wasn't vandalized? The sculpture has been vandalized. We never gave any voice to that because we didn't want to give a platform to the people who were doing those things. But this one was nature. This was not vandalism. And so what we've now created is a hybrid version. It's the coral stones that are there, and there's a VR version where you can hold up your phone. So we actually hired these software developers. So it's not like you got to download an app. You literally just hold it up and the digital version appears in a 360. So it's actually really cool. How much time do I have? Because there's one other project. Yeah, okay, cool. I'll end by talking about one of my more recent projects. So yeah, it was probably around, it got pushed back, so it was squarely inside of the pandemic. But I was invited to do a project at a space called Ariel. It was actually inside what was called the Women's Building. And you know, it was kind of thinking about like intercultural, cross-cultural feminism. So they invited me to do a project. It's a project space. So it literally was, you're doing an exhibition in this little display case window. And then the curator, Daniela Agostino, who was invited to work with me, she started doing research on the building. And we learned that one of the founders of this building was the same woman who had done this very famous colonial exhibition. As many of you may know, like in the early 1900s, there were lots of these big world colonial exhibitions that were going on where colonies were like, look at my colonies, no, look at my colonies, you know, it was like these kind of like, who got the best, you know, and they were kind of showing artifacts. Sometimes they would show people, they were kind of showing off. And she thought it'd be a really good idea to bring people from the Virgin Islands to this exhibition, but she couldn't find any adults. So she orchestrated for 2 children to come. She basically orchestrated that 2 children would be kidnapped, basically. So 2 children, Victor Cornelians and Alberta Roberts were, I don't know what they said to their mothers to allow them to come unaccompanied, but they were sent to Denmark. And some of the early images, this is part of the video piece that I had done. This is the amount of people who came to see them. It was over 10,000 people that came. And not only, of course, in the exhibition, as they are children and they were unaccompanied, they would not stay in the exhibition. They would kind of go around playing in the Greenland section and et cetera. So they decided to put them in cages to keep them still. And so after the exhibition was over, they were put in orphanages. They were not returned. And Alberta died. She actually was buried the day that the transfer happened. And so for the 100th year, there was a commemoration to her and her life. She died of tuberculosis. But Victor, the boy, actually lived a long life, and he actually wrote a memoir about his experience being in the cages. And we learned that he like spit on people when they would try to touch him. You know, he was abused. I mean, there was all these things. Imagine me being asked to do an exhibition in this building, knowing the history, knowing the woman that, you know, started the same building. I couldn't ignore this history. So of course now my exhibition is going to be about these children, but I decided, and this is kind of thinking about archives, I decided that I was not going to show images of them because it was a very popular street on Denmark. So imagine if I had like re-exhibited these, I was like, I'm not going to show images of these children, but I do want to engage with their story. So how am I going to do that? So the piece is called In the Place of Shadows, and it's a epistolary piece. I'm writing to them, to the children with the same care. It was really about like, how can I show care to their narratives, care to these children, even the way that I mention and talk about what happened to them. I even say at one point, forgive me, you know, for mentioning, you know, I know you were in these, like, so it's very, and it was thinking about how I tried to figure out like what, there were some images of them in Denmark, but I really wanted to focus on their first part of their childhood that they maybe even didn't have language for. You know, they're 2, 3, 4, 5 years old. What was that like in the Virgin Islands? And kind of almost give that back to them in a way. So I start trying to find the houses that they live. And so you see me kind of looking. And so it's a lyric video, where I very much kind of speak back to the archives, but also really realize that so much of surviving this colonial nostalgia is also really placing our own subjectivity into it. And reshaping, restaging, et cetera. And so the piece definitely, I think, does that. And I think I'll end here so we can still have some time for questions.
We do have a few minutes for Q&A, so I think in the interest of time and organization, what we will do is we'll take a couple of questions and comments from our in-person group, and then a couple online, and then back and forth. So who would like to begin? Who has a comment, question? Yes.
Thank you very much for this fantastic presentation, really very generative. There's something that stands out to me in a lot of the images. The ways in which I think what we say was the kind of piecing together of things from the past, say living in remnants, using real as the basis from which to build. I was wondering if you could speak more to that, what attempts to mix fragments together as a way of imagining a different, a counter history.
Yeah.
On the one hand, and the role that the visual has to play in that, because if you have all this patchwork, the picture is not going to be clear. It's going to be like jigsaw puzzle thing. I was wondering if you could speak more to it as how that as an aesthetic informs your work. And thank you very much.
It's almost, thank you so much for that question, because it gives me an opportunity to talk about the last work that I didn't get to show, which was what I'm actually working on right now in the studio, which is a series of work that pieces together fragments. It's called Storm, How to Imagine the Tropicalia as Monumental, and very much thinking about how these violent histories, these fragmented histories, even in some ways our fragmented selves, how we reconstruct them to create something new, and how that is, that work is the memory work, that work of kind of re-engaging with these fragments and reconstructing them. And this work is created, actually, originally I started it from, my studio got damaged in the hurricanes in 2018 or 17, actually. And some of the paper that I thought was saved, when I started to pull it out, it just started to crumble. And before I threw it out, I had a friend and colleague who said, "But Vaughn, you deal with archives, like this is an archive to the storm, why don't you use it?" So that's how I started using these ripped pieces of paper and kind of piecing them together. So yes, it's an important observation that my work deals a lot with this fragmentation. And I think for me, I mean, it's a part of healing. It's a part of taking control of the narrative. It's a part of just what we do. It's as Caribbean people. I mean, even the way we speak English, people have called it broken English or broken French, but it's really taking structures of other languages and repurposing the dominant colonial language that we're now being imposed to speak. And kind of, we have fragments of indigenous African languages that are still come through. I mean, so it's that same, I feel like it's a reflection of our survival coping mechanisms, which is why for me, it was important not to have escape, but it was really about surviving colonial nostalgia. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Laverne, for your presentation. While listening to you, your work actually took me into a different direction. I mean, I was thinking of Albert Levin's work, The Colonized and the Colonized, also thinking of the voice work on global consciousness. Well, I'm quite curious, how do you engage respectability politics as an artist? When I mean respectability politics, especially in the aftermath of the death of the Queen of England, there's this demand that you can't really speak about colonial violence. Like there's a silences, and the silences is not just even in like images or in the archive. You now see the silences even in the public space. So as an artist, how do you engage with this, demand for respectability politics? That you should not really talk about this like trauma, as you view them or show them like images in archive, because you don't want to like offend the progenitors or the progenitors of the beneficiary of the colonial establishments.
Well, I don't care too much about that on that end. I mean, obviously the work that I'm doing, but I do think that I've had to go through my own process of untethering, because I am a colonial being. Like, so to pretend that I'm above that, in the same way that white people can't pretend they're above racism, I can't pretend that so I have to wrestle with certain things in myself. I think the swarm piece, that was a part of me kind of like, what am I protecting? Even in myself, like I had to deal, I mean, I met the Queen of Denmark during the 2017. And that was also an example for me of how to, because we were told it was an exhibition that was dealing with the colonial history. She was allowing her family collection of the furniture that was taken back to be presented in a palace. And they had invited me and Jeanette to also participate in the exhibition. And that was uncomfortable for us because we're like, our work kind of challenged it. Like they know that, like how is this? And I will admit, you do kind of get swept up in I learned that really in participating in that exhibition, because no matter how powerful we thought our works were, the opulence of the palace, the opulence of that narrative, the grandiosity of the Queen and how the whole room shifted when she came in and all the pomp and the circumstance, all those things that create these colonial nostalgic traditions, it's very challenging, So on the one hand, it's different to do it like in your academic spaces, your museum spaces, but to confront the Queen right there, it was a little, you get a little shook a bit, I mean, when I asked her about, thank you for letting your work be a part of exhibition, are you planning on doing more dialogues around colonial history? She gave me what I call the ice gaze. I mean, she totally transformed, monarchs are not allowed to be political, which is of course the ultimate political statement. So when I asked her anything that was so-called political, she just wouldn't respond. And I thought it was such an interesting I mean, not even just a metaphor. It was really like this confrontation of silence, this wall of silence that I had physically experienced talking to her. And so, I mean, I think it's just something we still have to work on. We still always have to have the courage to confront it, not just, but mostly within ourselves. A lot of my project for me is like, how do we deal with the coloniality in our being? Because this is what I grew up in. So, you know, and also I showed you the tourism image. This is what we're feeding back to ourselves. That same. So it's difficult. It's an ongoing process.
So I'd like to move to a question from online, and unfortunately it will have to be our last in the interest of time. So the person asks, in the theme of our seminar series, so much of your work feels like it's about breaking out of the confines of the traditional archive. Could you share more about how it is that you engage material culture, and what do recovery, conservation, and preservation mean to you?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I feel like I'm creating another archive that's both a part of the traditional colonial one, but also creating something new. I mean, so when I did my Arata piece, that is another archive. You know, I penetrated hers and started to create my own. And I feel like that I feel is a part of my project to kind of, I don't know if I would call it a counter archive. I feel it's both maybe counter, but also an alternative one, and also recognizing archives in places that, remember, the quote unquote traditional archives were taken, but we have archives in our body, we have archives in our ritual, we have archives in our song, we have archives in our rituals of remembering, we have archives in the way that we honor still Queen Mary. You know, there are other archives that I also pull from. I think my challenge that I find is also having to, inside myself, always remember that all of these archives are unfixed and unstable, because sometimes you have this idea that the ones in Denmark are the real archives. They're the state, and that our oral traditions and our ritual, those are like the unfixed, the malleable, and they're both unstable and they're both unfixed and they both have projected. So it's to remember that. That's what I think a lot of my work is trying to do by juxtaposing those things, inserting new ones, is to kind of destabilize all of them.
I'm being sick of what's supposed to, I think, that this is the first of the series again, and we'll be back in a few weeks with a keynote lecture. So thank you again so much. Really great conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.